I'm Tina Srabotniak. I'm the acting head of programming here at the Appel Salon. Very happy to welcome you tonight to this event featuring Sheila Watt-Cloutier in conversation with political analyst Allan Gregg. This event is part of the library's Aboriginal celebrations, which have been going on for the month of June across the city at many of our branches. I hope you've been able to go to some of them. We had an event here about 10 days ago, which was fabulous, with Joseph Boyden and Thomas King and Lee Maracle. And it was a really wonderful, we had drumming and dancing. It was terrific. We know how to party at the library. That's all I can say. There are still a few events in our Aboriginal celebrations which are still ongoing, and I'll just draw your attention particularly to one. It's right across the street at our Yorkville branch, and it's a discussion of the Ogima Makana project, which is the project that's renaming Toronto streets, giving them back their native names, and it's with the project's organizers, Susan Blight and Hayden King. That's tomorrow night at our Yorkville branch at 7 o'clock. This is our last event of the spring season, and we're going to have a little nap now until September when we open our fall season, and we're going to launch that with Jonathan Safran Foer in September. He's the guy who wrote Everything is Illuminated and Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and he has, I think it's his first novel in 10 years, so he's going to be here on September the 9th. We'll also be welcoming Emma Donoghue, who has a new book. Carl Hyacin, I don't know if you know him, the Miami-based, hysterically funny crime writer. Oxymoron, funny crime writer, but so he is. Robert Harris, the terrific writer who wrote The Ghost Writer, which they made into that movie. And also most recently he did a trilogy based on Cicero, which was really magnificent, got rave reviews. He has a new novel. And Ann Patchett will be here, of course, Bel Canto and State of Wonder and all those other wonderful books. She'll be here in October. We've got much more coming. Details will be up on our website around the beginning of July. This is also my last event. As you know, I've been acting. Well, we've hired a new person who won't be acting. He'll be the real thing. His name is Gregory McCormick, and he's going to be great. He comes to us from Blue Metropolis in Montreal, which is a very cool, hip, international literary festival. So he'll fit right in at the library, I'm thinking. He'll be greeting you in the fall. This event is being taped and will be up on our website in about 10 days. If you're on Twitter, you can follow us at Toronto Library, and the hashtag is Appel Salon. After the event, Sheila Watt-Cloutier will be signing books. Our bookseller is Another Story. They're at the back. Thank you, Another Story. And then Sheila will be signing at the very back of the room. So to get things started tonight, I'm going to introduce our host, Allan Gregg. Allan is a pollster, consultant, and political commentator, much missed, may I say, on the At Issue panel on CBC. And of course, he hosted many seasons of Allan Gregg in Conversation with on TV Ontario. He's very active in the arts community, having chaired the Toronto Film Festival, the Walrus Foundation, and produced recordings by the Tragically Hip. And he's a passionate advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples. Please welcome Allan Gregg.
Thank you very much. While I'm delighted to be here, I was a little suspicious when Tina tried to drag me out of mothballs on the erroneous assumption that I still may have some currency as a consequence of having spent the major part of my career on television. I enjoyed what I did on in television, but be very honest, I don't miss it at all. It's a very powerful medium. It has the ability to engender this sense of intimacy, familiarity. I was constantly struck by how comfortable people seemed to be walking up to me, engaging in conversations, and sometimes writing me long letters explaining their points of view on a particular issue. But the real nature of the medium came to me when I got one of those letters. And it was in regard to a show I had done on TVO. And it said, "Dear Mr. Gregg, I'm writing to you about a recent conversation you had with evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould concerning his theory of disequilibrium in the Jurassic period. My question for you is this. What's with your hair?" Now, we're not here to talk about the travails of appearing on television. We're here to hear from someone, a guest tonight who is nothing short of a national treasure. She has dedicated her life not to just saving her people, but also our planet. Along the way, for her dedication, persistence, and spirit, Her work has been recognized by a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, the United Nations Champions of the Earth Award, a citation for lifetime achievement from the Canadian Environmental Awards Committee, the Rachel Carson Prize, and no less than 15 honorary doctorate degrees from virtually every university in Canada. From someone who actually was in a doctorate program, for someone who was in a doctorate program and never finished, that kind of sucks. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Now, those who haven't yet read your book, but will after they buy one later on this evening, might ask, what is the right to be cold?
Inuit culture is based on the ice, the snow, and the cold. And with all of the changes that have been happening over the last 10, 20 years with the environmental degradation of the Arctic, we are now defending our right to be Inuit as we know it, in terms of being able to travel safely on the ice, on the snow, because for us, it is about mobility and transportation. And when that starts to go, then it's safety and security issues immediately, along with many other rights, our right to health, our right to culture, our right to educate our children on that ice, which is very powerful. All of those rights that are already entrenched in international law are diminished as a result of climatic changes that are happening. So we are fighting for our right to be cold, because that right to be cold is about our culture. But that right to be cold also connects for everybody's right to a great environment, healthy environment.
I want to get into that in a little bit more depth. But first, among your many accomplishments, probably what you're known for most is being the person who actually linked climate change to human rights. Now, for many, that's not an obvious linkage, climate change, human rights.
Right.
Expand on that whole idea for me.
Well, I'll start with a story, because when I received the Sophie Prize in Norway back in 2007, around that time, I was there presenting something, and we were in a setting, and one of the players who was there was the head of Amnesty International. He received a call from a journalist, and he said, that woman, that Inuit woman from the Arctic who launched the first legal petition targeting the United States for their inaction as a violation of the human rights of Inuit, has just received the Sophie Prize, and you may end up getting a call from media. And he said, she did what? Because even Amnesty International scratched their heads, but not for long. Because he's telling me this, he's saying, I got it right away, like not too long after, but at first, because people were much more aware of or knew the linkage with individual rights being violated, but not collective rights. And so in that sense, this was very new ground that we were breaking. We had to. We had just come out of the negotiations with the POPs Treaty, the persistent organic pollutants that were poisoning our food chain. We knew how tough that was to get the world to understand these issues for what they are, that they're not just environmental issues, they are health first and foremost, they're about cultural survival. So when we launched that petition, it was breaking new ground. People just didn't make that connection. But within about 5 years, a very short period of time, it became mainstream language. So I think we changed that discourse globally.
Well, let's talk about that event. It's kind of 2005. You're the international president of the Inuit Circumpolar Chair. And you launch a petition with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguing that unchecked carbon emissions from the United States was violating the culture and human rights of Inuit people. What happened?
Well, it took a year before we got a response, a full response.
At first, they didn't want to hear you.
Well, that came after. There was silence. There was complete silence for a long time. And that was frustrating. But after a year, there was a response, and it was a very short, curt letter. We don't see the connection, the legal connection, between climate change and human rights. Well, I'm pretty persistent. So I said, you can't leave us hanging like this. We know the reality of this situation for us. It is indeed a human rights issue. And with that persistence and the letter writing that I did with my team, then they opened up the floor and said, okay, come down. We'll have a session where you can come and testify, not the Inuit petition itself, but the legal impacts of climate change and human rights. And if you may, can you give other examples around the world?
And this was the first time they had done that?
The first time they had done that. It was a historical.
Dealt with that subject.
That's right, yeah.
And what was the consequences?
Well, I mean, when we did go down and we made those linkages for them, it was an education process for them. I mean, you have to, later on, in hindsight, and you're thinking through things when things didn't come through, and it's not to judge anybody, but these were 9 men from very hot countries, Latin speaking. They couldn't speak English. I don't think they had ever seen snow or ice, much less know that ice and snow is a life force for people, right? And so that was part of it, of course, but in those days there was a lot of politics with the Bush administration. So we knew there was a hold, because the first time we heard that they weren't going to hear our testimony or our petition was from State Department that told one of our lawyers. So how did they know? How did State Department know, that they weren't going to go through? So there were some of those politics at play. But we did go, and I think we educated them. And the chair himself said to me, we will be in touch because we really want to move forward with this, with a translator. We never heard from them. We never heard from them.
Yeah, you said 5 years after that, this linkage is fairly well accepted and understood.
Since 5 years after. We launched it in 2005, and by 2010 it was mainstream language. The UN had started to make statements to that effect. Many others around the world were making that linkage.
And how has that changed anything?
Well, I think it's changed because if you fast forward, I mean, you would think that over the years it didn't really change much. But, for the first time, I think the Paris document, the Paris UNFCCC now indicates the language of human rights is in that document. I think we would have wanted it to be more in the operative text to give it more teeth, but it is in the preambular text for sure. And people are moving in that direction, I believe, much more than they ever have. So it takes an awful long time for the international arena to come to that point, but I think we're getting there. We're getting there.
You spent the better part of your adult life making the point that the Arctic matters. This is not just a remote
Ice matters.
reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that, in fact, the Arctic is the barometer for the health of the entire planet.
That's right.
How so?
Well, if you want to know the health of our entire planet, you go to the Arctic to take its pulse, and that's how you know. The Arctic the Arctic ice is the cooling system for the planet. And so when you know that as the Arctic, especially Greenland ice sheet that is on land, melts, it is creating sea level rise in other parts of the world. And those people who are in the small island developing states, for example, are having to be relocated as a result of the Arctic melt. And so you can't get clearer than that in terms of understanding that connection, that as the Arctic melts, other places are sinking. As the cooling system breaks down, the air conditioner breaks down, we know that it's creating havoc with the wildfires out west, with the tornadoes that are much more intense, the droughts. All of those things are connected to what's happening in the Arctic. And that's just how well connected we all are, no matter where you are on the planet.
You've taken it one step further, and I want to read a quote here because I found it very interesting. You said, if we allow the Arctic to continue to melt, we lose more than the planet that has nurtured us for all human history. We lose the wisdom required for us to sustain it.
That's right.
Expand on
That's
that for
right.
me.
Well, when you're talking about for us as Inuit, we are hunters. We are gatherers still. We are fishers still. We are out there depending upon the well-being of our climate and our environment to bring home the nutritious food for our families and our communities. But it's not just about the technical aspect of the hunt that's important. When we teach our children how to go out and be natural conservationists and to be very focused and become very proficient providers for the community, we are also teaching them the life skills and the character skills that are required to really know about themselves. The technical aspect of the hunt is about how the world works, but the actual character building and life skills that is learned on the land are about how you work And institutional schooling and learning, when it came into the Arctic, severed all of that and never brought it back anywhere else. And so we're not only dealing with tumultuous changes and traumatic issues, you know, the intergenerational legacies that have been left behind by the abuses of systems and people, but we're dealing with a severed education system that we once had for our children that not only prepared them to survive and thrive on the land, but those skills that you bring, that you learn on the land and the ice and snow traditionally are very transferable to the modern world. In fact, to me, they're a requirement. Because when you're faced with a fast transitioning world like ours, and where you're faced with all of these tumultuous changes and stressors, all the more those kinds of skills to be able to cope, to have the resiliency built in you, are more important than any other time in history in our world. But yet, here we are losing that ability and that wisdom that has been passed down to be able to cope and deal with stressors because they're transferable to the modern world. And so it's not just about the ice, it's the wisdom that will go too. And if you think that we don't have high enough suicide rates and violence and abuses that are happening where we're losing that generation in numbers that are just so very sad, then take away that ice and you'll see that there will be many more stressors. And already there are many more stressors coming about as a result of the precariousness of what's happening with our environment.
It's been over 10 years since you petitioned the Inter-American Commission. I mean, you see some things are moving forward, but you're seeing that some things are moving backwards. I mean, you're talking about the Inuit losing that way of life and the attendant impacts that have. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going and where we're at right now?
I wouldn't be doing what I do if I were pessimistic, honestly. I mean, it's not just, you know, words or cliche, but you know, I have 2 grandsons that are raised in the Arctic, and they're being raised. My grandson just graduated high school 2 days ago. And I have a little 3.5-year-old who's up there. My daughter lives in Iqaluit. So for me, it's really about our children. It's really about trying to get that grounding back. I remember the day when I had all that. You know, I grew up traveling only by dog team the first 10 years of my life. I didn't know any English till I was 6. I'm of the era where, you know, the white fathers came, but they didn't stay. So I may have, you know, the genetics of this very fair-haired girl as I was growing up, but I was raised very traditionally by a mother and a grandmother, single mothers. And we lived very traditionally. And they were survivors, the women that raised me. And so that tradition, I remember the foundation I had. And it is that foundation that I had as a child that allows me to do what I do today. And it has stayed with me in terms of being able to overcome those stressors that I've had in my own life and my community has had. So I know the importance and I know how critical that is for our younger generation to keep having that connection. And it keeps you connected because for me, I've always said, isn't it because the urban setting has disconnected from each other and its environment and its food source that we're even debating the issue of climate change in the first place? So listen to the people who are still fighting for that right to be connected to the land, the ice, the environment, to its food source, because we know a little bit about sustainability and we can teach a little bit about that model that the world seems to be hungry or trying to find back. So it's that connection, I think, to nature and to the land that is so important for us, that is just more than just, you know, whether it's song or legends or folklore, even those are very important in and of themselves, but it's really that solid connection that we need to find for all of us, Canadians and beyond.
At the political level, I was at the First Ministers' Conference in Vancouver in March, following the Paris conference on climate change. And a number of the premiers I talked to really thought we are on the precipice of change. They're saying, look, the climate deniers are in retreat. We're going to put a price on carbon. That's absolutely guaranteed. Business community's finally getting it, that this is not negotiable. Are they right?
Insurance companies.
Insurance companies,
Big
yes.
time.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember in Argentina, at one of the UNFCCC meetings that were held there during the negotiations, the United Nations Environment Program on climate change. And we were there as we were preparing to launch the petition. I remember in one of those talks, and this goes back, way back now, saying it will only be a matter of time that money will talk, because it will be insurance companies that are going to be all part of that. And watching the news lately, you know, I say, this is what we've been trying to say for years, not just the ice is melting, woe be us. It's about all of these other things that are connected to the economy, to the environment. All of those are, because we silo those issues as though they were all separate. You know, even in our government systems, we have the Minister of Industry, for example, and the Minister of the Environment. They don't come together and discuss what we need to do as Canadians, you know. Everything is siloed. Our education systems are siloed. Our universities are siloed with the various disciplines. And I think, for me, it's always been trying to tell the story from the Inuit perspective where everything is holistic. You know, the culture and the way in which we teach our children for the challenges and opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, are in a very holistic way.
Well, I want to get into that even a little bit more, and I want to take you back a little bit. I mean, you grew up in Nunavik, in northern Quebec, and as you said, you had a very traditional life. You rode around on dog sleds. You hunted as a young girl. Yet you kind of cheekily asked at one point in time, you say, people might ask, who needs to hunt anymore? Answer your own question for me.
I think, you know, I'm not suggesting to the world that we all become hunters, because it's not going to happen. But I'll tell you this. Again, I'll go back to a story. Just before launching the petition, I was in Washington, D.C. at a press conference. I think Allison Smith was there with CBC. And someone in the audience said, why don't you people just get on board and become really good?
Yeah, so fit in.
Yeah, fit in. Become engineers, architects, whatever. Get on side. And my response to him was, we're living in a world where there's such a disconnect to each other, our environment, all of those things. I said, and as Inuit, we still remain very connected to our environment. We respect all that is around us. We don't waste the food that we eat everything of the animal. And we try our best to live from the foundations and the principles and values that kept us alive, not just alive, but thriving all this millennia, where most people would die in an hour. We have been able to survive and thrive. And I said to him, why would it be us changing? Why would it be us? You know? Why would we, who are trying to signal, why would it be us? But I also said to him, at the time I only had the one grandson, I said, but it is not to say that I wouldn't want my grandson to be, at the time he was a hockey player, so I said to be the best darn hockey player, but yet have that connection to the land. Or if he wanted to be an engineer or an architect, he would at least have that connection and bond. And anything that he did in the modern world would be driven by his knowledge and connection to the land.
Sure.
You know, whether he could be engineering something very special and very different.
But it's not an either or.
Yeah, it's not either or at all. And so it is about that. It is really about, because the kids that have learned a lot about those values and principles and learning about themselves and being able to survive and cope with the stressors from the traditional way are the kids that are making it in the modern world. So it isn't about either or, it's taking the best of both. And that's what we're trying to do with the next generation.
As happened far too often for your generation of Indigenous children. You were taken from your family when you were 10 years old, sent to live with a white family in Nova Scotia. You say in the book that this was a brutal shock.
It was.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it was. I mean, you can just imagine. You must have children. At 10, they're being sent to, let me see, I don't know, China or somewhere else, you know, for a long, and in those days, we had super Constellation planes that took 8 hours just to get to Montreal. So you can imagine, this is very far. And then another flight, you know, 3 hours later, you know, and I write about this experience. It was very, very traumatic for us, 2 little girls, 10 years old. And today I still ask the question, how did our parents get convinced? How did my mother get convinced to send us off so young? But for them, It was, if they get educated, then they can come back and they can be much more helpful to, the future of our people. And so that was the way, I think, because in the First Nations, there were no permissions, taken from the parents. They were often very just taken. For us, there was a little bit more, because it was later in life. Don't forget, in the Arctic, because of the cold, we were spared from people coming up until about, the 60s or so, when the government started to come. But when they did come, that's when, things started to
and they took the children.
Yes, and many of us, as I said, 2 years in Nova Scotia. I spent 3 years at the residential setting in Churchill, Manitoba.
This was,
was run by the government.
2 years later. Now, there's one of the most surprising parts of the book, because you say, we've learned from the Truth and Reconciliation the horror and the shame of residential schools.
Right.
Yet you say those 3 years were among the happiest of your teenage life.
Again, that residential school was not mission run. It was run by the feds from Ottawa. Right. And the man running it, we were in the hands of someone who seemed to have cared genuinely for Inuit children. And he handpicked the supervisors that would work there to begin with. And I'm not suggesting there weren't any abuses, because it was only through the Truth and Reconciliation process we learned that there had been some. But most of us felt safe there. Not only did we feel safe, there was a sense of connection to the discipline that was happening there, which was quite fair, but strict, very strict. Because what most people don't understand is that Inuit culture and tradition is extremely strict and self-disciplined. We had to, or we wouldn't survive.
Right.
And people depended on each other to survive every minute, every hour of our day. And so we could relate to that. It wasn't so foreign to us. Mind you, marching 2 by 2 to the cafeteria and
you had a
all
number.
those things. We had a number. I was number 8. When we arrived, all of our clothing, our underwear, everything was marked with a number. We were lined up. In the middle of the night, we arrived on a chartered airplane from Nunavik and Nunavut. At the time, it was northern Quebec and Northwest Territories. Right. And off we went and arrived at 2 or 3 in the morning and lined up, and the lice, liquid, whatever, in your hair, and off we, that's how it all happened. And your question was?
It's just, I was so surprised that, because I read the victim speak from the Truth and Reconciliation in one of their reports, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And your story wasn't as horrible.
And most people who have gone to Churchill, Manitoba will tell you the same. We,
It was a vocational school.
It was a vocational school.
With residents, but it was...
3-year program.
Right.
But we were 200 kids together. And as I say, as a rule, we were safe. Again, as I say, and it's not to dismiss those who were abused that we didn't know about until very recently. But we had a lot of sports. We were always together. I was there with my older sister, who's now passed away.
That was the purpose, you were getting reunited.
Yes, because I had been sent, Lizzie and I, my friend and I, had been sent to Nova Scotia when we were 10, and we were alone with the family. But then we were and for us, it was like heaven.
So there was
with
a sense
our older
of community.
sisters. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so we were with 200 other kids, and it was, So, and it was the day of the rock and roll had come in, right? And so that's one of the chapters I have is from from dog teams to mini skirts to rock and roll. And
right after the Beatles. It'd be what, 64.
The Beatles. That was our band. Yeah.
Now let's back on the serious
Along
stuff
with the Harpoons.
The Harpoons.
We had the band, the Harpoons, with William Taguna, who is a famous CBC journalist.
Yes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. New government comes in, says we will adopt all 94 recommendations. Mm-hmm. Stunning. Mm. Is this going to make a difference, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. But again, I just read something today where the chair of the commission had indicated, we've got to take action on the recommendations. I think it will, but just like any other issue in dealing with Aboriginal issues, the Indigenous issues, including climate change, people are at a loss as to what do we do? How do we do it? And I think sometimes people tend to wait for whether it's government or economists or specialists of some kind to start taking the action on these issues. And for me, it's about all of us, as mothers, grandmothers, uncles, aunts, whoever you are. It's about us. It's that connection, the human connection. And on Friday, I'm going to be delivering a TED Talk in Calgary. And more and more recently, and I don't want to steal my own thunder here, or let everything out of the bag so that you can all watch it, but the connection that hasn't been made very well, and it keeps being siloed. And I was at the House of Commons not too long ago in the gallery as a guest. And I was witnessing our government, debating the issue of suicides in our communities in Ottawa-Pascat in particular, and then quickly switching the issue to climate change. For me, those two issues are rooted in a common history and even the current issues, and that's trauma. And that's my talk will be about that, connecting the two. Because it's really about the human trauma of our communities and what we have to do to try to rectify that and come to common ground as Canadians to understand it better so that we can feel more compassion for one another and not be othering each other so much. And it's about the trauma. It's not just changes anymore our climate's going through. It's climate trauma now. So we have to put all of these things together and work with each other, not just government.
Well, and you talk about the role of the individual. I mean, I look at polls, and one of the things that is really frustrating is that you see, especially for urban whites, who, even of very good intention, they see that the problems facing Indigenous communities are so huge and intractable, and the chasm between Indigenous and non-Indigenous is so wide and unfair that they feel exhausted by this. I mean, what is the advice to people like that who are of goodwill, but they just say, how do I stop the glaciers from melting? How do I stop horrid inequities continuing to be a scar on our national character?
Well, first of all, face your own fears. Face your own fears, because that's probably what's blocking you. You're overwhelmed with thinking that you have to do something huge and monumental all at once in the same week and change your perspective on something that you have been probably trained not to do for a long time, for generations ago. And most people who have come to see the problems that we face in the Arctic, the social issues. When you see the statistics, you see them on TV and radio and print, about all of these problems. But what you don't see is the context of why they're there. And when I taught in the last few years, I was a visiting scholar at Bowdoin College in Maine and at Mount Allison in New Brunswick. The kids in the States, I kind of forgave them for being so ignorant on Arctic issues, the human side of it, because after all, I thought, well, they're American and they don't know much about the Canadian context. So when I went to New Brunswick, I thought, I wonder how much better our Canadian kids are going to fare. They knew nothing of the history of our country. They knew nothing of the atrocities that have happened, even just in the Inuit world of the forced relocations, the dog slaughters, kids being sent away and losing their bond with their community, people who have been sent away for health issues and never to be heard from again because they died far away from home where families still try to find their grave. All of these things that have been happening over the last many years, the collapse of the sealskin market as a result of the emotionally driven, conservationists or animal rights folks. All of those combined have led to what we're faced with today, where we lost that sense of self-worth and that sense of our identity that was stripped in so many ways, and our ability to think that we have some control over our lives. And what has taken over is because of that dispiritedness, we try to find it in the bottle or the drugs or self-destruction. And that is trying to reach towards a way to alleviate those stressors and the pain that has been caused by trauma. And that's what I'm saying. So the erratic behavior in our communities that you see, in terms of, because that's not our natural state of affairs for us. It's not our natural way to be suiciding and to be abusive and to be violent. In fact, the hunter spirit is the total opposite of that. total opposite. And so the trauma, of the human is very much mirroring the trauma our climate is going through. We have done the same to our planet as we have done to Aboriginal peoples. And so to bring them together. But Friday,
Sure.
Calgary.
Friday TED Talk. Got it.
Yes.
Before you got really engaged in climate change, you had a very distinguished career in other areas. In 1992, you were a major contributor to a task force on educational reform in Nunavik that changed everything.
Well, we tried to change. We wanted to change everything.
Tell me about some of those recommendations and their application to other problems elsewhere.
Well, I had been a student counselor for 10 years, working with our youth in Kuujjuaq and then also in Montreal, where our post-secondary students go from Nunavik, because we're in Quebec, so off they go to Montreal to take CEGEP or university. And so I got to know and connect with what was happening in terms of not just the social and the baggage that they were carrying from home, but also the fact that we hadn't been preparing them properly, effectively, in the academic field. And that, we were, and I think that still happens today, unfortunately, in many of our systems, is that we social pass them. They're not necessarily succeeding, but we're passing them anyway.
Right.
And so, because there's a big difference between achievement and success. You can have anybody succeed, but are they really achieving? And so the kids, when they get out of grade 12, and that's not for everybody, but in many cases it is, have not been able to bridge that gap of the academic weakness that exists in many of our schools when they end up in the South. And so with the Makivik Corporation, which is the economic the organization that deals with the economic land claims, the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, in Quebec, really pushed our own school board, the Nunavik School Board, to set up together to set up a Nunavik Education Task Force. I became the Inuk advisor to that process. And because for us, it was about, here we have land claims organizations, we have Nunavik Regional Government, we have Nunavik School Board, we have the Makivik, we have all of these institutions which seemingly we are in control of, but yet, why are the suicides still rising? Why are our kids not really making it when they go beyond high school? What are we going to do about this? This is the future of Nunavik. How do we do this? And so it was a very intense time, and a very political time, because as short of a period it has been for us in the what I call it, the institutional world, because we're coming from the change has been just in the last couple of generations, not even hundreds of years, entrenched in an institution. Here we are fighting amongst each other now over overlap mandates and budgets and so on and so forth, saying, no, this is my responsibility, not yours. You can't change what I'm trying to do in education. You're the political body, and so on. So that kind of friction and confrontation was going on for a long time before we could even get to our work. And so finally, to make a long story short, we came out with 101 recommendations for change. And I think at the time we had kind of said, well, why 101? Well, Bill 101, we were kind of like, okay, pushing the government a little bit. So, and being in Quebec, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, those recommendations were very powerful, and we really did want to change almost everything. But again, I think some things have been implemented, others have not. And again, I had a conversation the other day with people I was working with at the time and said, we could go back to that report 25 years ago, and the introduction and the preambular language of that is still the same in our communities. So again, we're stuck in that paralysis of analysis, as we said in our report.
We've talked a lot about the impact that climate change has had on culture, Indigenous culture. Many believe, in addition, that education is the cornerstone of having Indigenous people play a full role in the Canadian fabric.
Yes.
You share that view?
I do. However, it can't be just window dressing again. It has to be genuine Aboriginal cultural worldviews that are also implemented in the curriculum. It can't be just programs, ad hoc programs, for example. Just because it's in Inuktitut doesn't make it strong.
It has to have the values and perspective.
It has to have the values. It has to have all of that, what I talked about, what we learn on the land, that if you can implement it into the classroom, we'll do so in a very powerful way, in the same way that we have done traditionally, if it can be done. Others you can't. You have to be out on the land to do it. But it was all of those things that we were debating. And it's still debated today in the government of Nunavut, where they're now suggesting that maybe we have been going the wrong direction in having too much Inuktitut. And I'm thinking, God, how can we be there in 2016
What's the
debating
thinking there?
this issue? Because they had some kind of a committee view this, who came out with the possibility that perhaps we're even backtracking or slowing down the process as a result of that. But for me, it's about the quality of the curriculum has just not been there. Because when you have programs, you develop programs, the programs don't necessarily make, or the materials, I should say, the material, you start off with creating material, developing materials. Those materials don't necessarily make for a program itself. And if there's no curriculum framework in which to hang them onto, then forget it. Everything is just ad hoc. And it's left up to the hardworking teachers to try to make school programs that work for their students. And so there's all of those details of what we need to do. So education is very important, but only if it's done really right. You can't just educate people without that wisdom piece added to that.
Who's going to take that leadership role?
Well, I mean, people are trying.
In the community?
Yes, and I think the next generation. I'm starting to see this younger generation who are not, they're not really out there yet, but they're starting to. They're just starting to network and talk to one another and plan for their future and their children's future. And when I talk about these younger generation, they're well-established young professionals in their 30s, early 40s, who are now starting, I think, to move in that direction of saying, this isn't working for us, and it's not going to work for our children and our grandchildren. And I think it's going to be a matter of time where they're going to start to put themselves in those leadership roles.
And there will be that change. And it is a more traditional cultural perspective that they're looking for.
Yes, because that generation, that some of them have really been raised traditionally by some of them even in their early 40s, were raised on outpost camps by grandparents. And when you have that grounding, that's what I mean by it's not either or. When you've had that grounding, you can create systems that have the roots implanted in those values and those principles as Aboriginal peoples, and just really create something in the modern setting. I have a friend who runs a business, Lena, called Perukvik Center in Iqaluit. She's close to my age, really dedicated to the protection and preservation of language and culture. She Inuitized many Microsoft programs for Microsoft. She has other programs are so amazing, but she's so rooted in her culture and language that it's so impressive. And I mean, I know there's two friends of mine that I realize are here, Nora Saunders and Liz Seal, who know her well, who have been Northerners for many years before. And she's just an amazing person, and that's the way to go. And she's now working on working towards and connecting with a university in the south so there can be PhD programs in Inuktitut, in our language. Because the elders carry that remarkable knowledge and wisdom that is so needed for the next generation to better understand and to have that pride that we are not a people who are just victims to globalization. We're not just victims to what's happened to us. We are more than that. We can rise back above that. We can reclaim what has been ours, and we can teach it through the modern technology. That's what Lena does with computers, even online, to teach Inuktitut online as well.
I want to shift gears just a little bit because you mentioned the Makivik Corporation set up after the very successful James Bay, North Quebec agreement in
Right.
1975 to manage that settlement and really land claims.
Yeah.
How important are land claims themselves to reconciliation, to finding that sense of self,
Yeah.
getting out of
Yeah.
that victim mode?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in the land claims. I've never really worked in those areas, except I was a corporate
You're
secretary.
corporate
for my
secretary
keeping,
to that,
but that
yes.
was more administrative. My family was very involved in that, as you may know, in the actual negotiations and so on. But I think the land claims have been really good in the sense that we have felt like we have better control over our lives in terms of the economy, in terms of developing co-management regimes with the federal government, in terms of, and the co-management regimes I mean by how our wildlife is protected and how we harvest our animals with quota systems and all of that, that makes it so that there isn't a waste of, or a way in which, how can I say, our animals are all, there's this kind of cultural and governmental policies that mesh quite well as a result of land claims agreements, because then we're able to work with the larger systems within our federal system of Canada in that way. But where the problem lies with the land claims, from my experience, and of course living in the communities, that includes in Nunavut and Nunavik, is that 25, 30 years after signing these land claims, we're still trying to implement them.
Oh, the success rate is appalling. I mean, they
It's
basically
terrible.
gave up in BC because they
Yes,
just couldn't get
it's
anything.
terrible.
Why is that?
So,
is it just a trust issue?
I think, I don't know if it's so much, I think it's hard for people to let go and think that, your child is going to actually be able to do things on their own. That's how governments work. And certainly that's been that, what is the term I'm looking for? Paternalizing.
Yes, patronizing.
Patronizing Aboriginal peoples as though they can't control their own lives. And that's how it's been with government. And every little thing is held on. And the bureaucracy that reigns in government is just terrible.
The Indigenous Affairs is the fifth largest department in government.
And so it is those issues with land claims. And again, as I say, I'm not doing justice to your question, but it really is about not implementing them once they're signed and having to negotiate and renegotiate for the last 25, 30 years.
I've got a few more questions, but we're going to throw it open to the audience. So anyone who has a question, they can line up behind that microphone, and I'll turn it over to you guys in just a few minutes. More recently, you've explained your style of activism. You've said...
I don't even say activism.
You said, I've always engaged in the politics of influence rather than the politics of protest.
Right.
Expand on that.
Yeah. I think it's in a sense two or threefold, actually. First of all, my makeup, my own psychological makeup, is not one to be rah, 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 As I say in the book, I'm an introvert doing extrovert work.
Yes.
So I'm not comfortable being...
With confrontation.
Well, I'm pretty assertive. So I can stand up and assert myself. And in fact, my grandson will say, calm down, it's okay, let them be or whatever. But I think it's more about this aggressive behavior. That's just not, and I'm not suggesting that people who are in that mode of working, the politics of confrontation sometimes can be effective, I suppose. But for me, it hasn't worked. I'm not comfortable in that to begin with. But also culturally, it's not something I grew up with. I'm 62 now, and it's not in those days how my early beginnings were with my grandmother, my mother, and my uncle, all very grounded in that hunter spirit energy of being very calm and reflective and inclusive and understanding and open. And that's how I've tried to honor and respect that from where I've come from in that way. And I have felt that by engaging in the politics of influence, for me, my experiences working through these especially with the POPs treaty, you know, in trying to get many countries on side to deal with the toxins in our food chain, was effective. To educate people, to reach out rather than striking out.
148 countries have signed on
Right.
since. Yeah, remarkable.
Yeah. And it was one of those treaties that in those days, in the history of the UN, was one of the fastest on record to have been signed, ratified, and enforced, because people came together through the human stories that we were able to bring. And that's what I mean by we have to come together as a common humanity now, you know? And if it's our common troubled atmosphere that does that, then so be it. But that's where we have to come together on that level, because we often, as I say, we think it's the academics that have the solutions, the economists, the politicians, the scientists, but really it's us. We have those solutions within us. And it's that understanding with one another that we can make those changes in our daily lives.
Question from the floor?
I seem to have somebody was ahead of me, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for coming to share with us today. One of the big issues in the Arctic is resource extraction and exploration, which has a big effect on climate change. So I wonder if you would talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I write.
We're going to see a little politics of confrontation now. She's no wilting violet on this one.
I don't know if it's so much confrontation as it is being really clear and assertive about how I feel about that. Well, you know, I write about this in the book, and I say, here we are, a people who are now carrying the brunt of pollution, whether it's the POPs that end up in our food chain, whether it's the CO2 emissions that are now creating havoc with our ice and our way of life in the Arctic. And because we are a people who, you know, through oppressive government policies and inappropriate traumas that have happened, hard traumas that have happened, the tumultuous changes and so on, are in this place where we are quite vulnerable, but we're also quite desperate for jobs in our communities. And the only carrot that seems to be now being dangled in front of us is to go out and dig up the very land that we hold sacred. And for me, my views on that is, let's be very cautious about what kind of business we're getting into, because not only is it going to destroy more land, more waters, more of our wildlife, with this very intrusive industries that have been known not to be that great around the world, and leaving the large footprint around the world, not to mention the devastation of, you know, the indigenous peoples on those lands. Why would we get into that kind of industry that is known to have not a very good reputation for that sort of destruction? And I don't think we have even gotten to the place where we can be very creative and innovative in finding other means and other ways to create sustainability for the Arctic, because we're so still dealing with the stressors of the past. We're still dealing with, you know, the addictions and the violence and the suicides that are happening. And we're in that state of worry and constant urgency or emergency for our people, with the food insecurity issues as well. All of those things combined. And I'm not trying to paint a picture of, you know, where we're sitting around being victims to all of this, because there's a parallel process happening in the Arctic that's just very powerful, especially with that generation I talked about earlier. There's incredible successes that are happening. But at the same time, getting back to the resource extraction industries, unless they are going to reinvent themselves just for the Arctic peoples, what are we doing?
Is the implication of that for you that it must stay in the ground?
Yes, for me. Maybe not for everybody in the Arctic, because
that is controversial.
It is controversial.
Yes.
It really is. But for me, it is safer in the ground than it is above. And we haven't even started to explore the remarkable ways in which we could create jobs and innovation in the Arctic.
Let me ask something very speculatively. I mean, if there was stewardship over.
Inuit, yeah.
Inuit
Yeah.
stewardship
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
resource extraction.
Yes, well, I think, I think people want that, and I think people genuinely are thinking that that's what is happening in those terms. I think there are hardworking people in Baffin Island themselves. Some organizations have really solid citizens who are working towards that balance. But, in Nunavik, going back to Makivik, in the days with the iron ore and all of that, I remember one negotiator saying, it's going to happen. We have to create jobs. We have to go in that direction. We understand that mining is like a cancer, but if we can make it as benign as possible, then let's try. And that's, basically, maybe that's what is going to happen with the leadership. I mean, I'm not, that's an opinion I have, just because of that. I know what it's like to, not everybody, I'm not suggesting not everybody doesn't know this, but working with the international community is a long process, very long process, to try to get 150, 200 countries in the world to come to a common ground to do something effective takes decades. And the UNFCCC process has taken how long? And we're not there yet.
Yeah.
In terms of addressing these issues. So we have to be very cautious about what more. Are we going to be part of the solution and model sustainability by standing on principle? Or are we going to be part of the problem that is creating the havoc in the Arctic in the first place? That's my question.
Another question from the audience?
It's somewhat on the same tone. You spoke about doing work with the small island states that are experiencing what it means to have the ice melt and the land change. And part of that is the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Having family that historically comes from that region and constantly going back and forth, having this conversation with relatives and friends and families up and down the archipelago, there's a bit of a disconnect still between what's happening up in the Arctic and literally watching the beaches disappear.
Yeah.
And a number of the small island states are actually below sea level. And they have resource issues too, because there is oil in them, their seas. Huge oil companies are coming to do natural gas and oil removal. And I feel like it's the same conversation happening in different geographies.
Right.
And there is somewhat a concerted effort to keep the two groups of people from really actually looking each other in the eye and realizing it's the same devil at the dance. So I'm curious how you have been able to do that. Because I know in these international spaces, certain members of our states get to go, and the people that actually live in those villages only hear them talk about this through the newspaper or through some international visitor coming off of a cruise ship, but they're never actually having the opportunity to understand that it's the same devil at the dance in the South as it is in the Arctic, and that we actually share a lot of similar histories around schooling and education, except in the Caribbean, we were made to feel very proud in our parents when they got sent away to school to England, and it was great to receive scholarships from our previous slave owners, and it was really highlighted as a blessing to be that bright, and they have yet to recast it in the truth and the trauma that we see. So I'm curious, how do you think we can get that conversation going for the generation like myself, and we call ourselves often the diasporic babies, because we're not all born there, and we're not all born here, and we're halfway in the middle in neither of either, but very clear that it's not
We're going to let
working.
Sheila answer that question.
Sure. In 2005, when I launched the Human Rights Petition at the UNFCCC in Montreal, it was the same time that through the United Nations Environment Program, I also launched a program called Many Strong Voices. And that linked the Arctic vulnerable peoples to the small island developing states. That program has been ongoing, but again, it's the resources, the funding to keep that going strong and alive, so that many strong voices, those who are taking part in that, and those are people from the Arctic and from the small island developing states, can partake in some of these negotiations that are going on at the UNFCCC level. Again, the intention was to build that working connection with the two vulnerable peoples of the world that are most impacted by climate changes. And where there is that connection, it's very clear, as you say and as I say, and many do, about the Arctic smelt and the sinking. Again, it's the resources which really don't support the people to be able to be more active in that. The other, where I have looked someone in the eye recently, was he is a politician actually from the Marshall Islands, Tony LeBlum. I don't know if you know him. Both he and I received the Right Livelihood Award in November from Sweden. And recently, upon hearing some of my interventions during that period, just leading up to Paris, he wanted to go north. So he's just, I think, leaving, or he's just coming back from Alaska, so that he could make that connection with the people of the Arctic. And because he's a politician, he's an elected official, he probably can make more headway now in terms of making that connection long-lasting and perhaps more effective on that front, because he was a key player. For us as Aboriginal people, if we're not elected in the federal systems that we're in, we don't have the same influence in those negotiations at the global level. We go to side events and so on, but we're not in the trenches. Tony was able to be because he is a politician for his country. And it is through that kind of voicing, I think, that we'll make more headway with that kind of connection that is happening. So Google his name.
I am going to.
And then go from there. Yeah.
Well, the tyranny of time is upon us. So on behalf of everyone in the room, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, Allan. Thank
Real
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you.